Guys. Well, thanks for attending. Should we start?
Yeah, we're on time, so.
All right. So, hi, I'm Vaughn, and it's nice to be here. This is what we would call in the United States a grassroots conference or meetup or something, right? Maybe you don't even like to think of yourself as a conference. I don't know.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah. So I hope I didn't insult you by calling it a conference, but so it's nice to be here and see folks that are so interested in software development and willing to take the time on a weekend to meet up like this. And so I hope I'm going to add some value to your learning experience here. What I'm going to talk about today is event storming. This is a technique that I learned about, 3.5 years ago. I was doing what I call IDDD tour. I'm the author of Implementing Domain-Driven Design. Some of you may have read it. And by the way, this book is going to be translated to Spanish. You know, Sergio, what is his last name? Sergio? He's not attending. Is it Moya? You know him?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's going to be translating my book. Let me just double check my Twitter, make sure I have the name correct. Moya, Sergio Moya.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So he's going to be translating my book to Spanish. And anyway, so here I was in the middle of what I call my IDDD tour. It was right after my book was released, and I went throughout Europe, and I charged for I actually had a 4-day class. My class was normally 3 days long, but I added a 4th day to bring in some other DDD and other practitioners in the software industry who I was interested in, and I would charge based on 100 euros per day. So my class was only 400 euros, and now my class is 1,800 euros. So just to give you an idea that I was trying to help the community, and it was very interesting. And one of the experts that I brought in to travel with me on this tour was Alberto Brandolini. So you guys know Alberto. Alberto came up with this idea of event storming. So that's where I got the idea. Now what I'll say, and I had some conversations yesterday about this, is I probably use event storming a little bit differently than Alberto. In fact, he and I were recently at the same client working, not together, but on the same project. He was doing one thing, I was doing another. And so after 3.5 years of not seeing Alberto working with event storming, I got to see him again working with event storming, and I have to say that his perspective on it seems to be different from mine. What I attempt to do with event storming is actually understand the source code artifacts that are going to be created on a project. Now, Alberto admits that event storming can be used with, like a big picture viewpoint, and then you can also go to design level with it. I'm more of the design level guy with this tool. Alberto tends to go big picture, and so to some people that might feel like big design up front, okay, and not very agile. What I will say is either way that you approach this, I think it's agile because it's very rapid. Even if you go for the big picture first and then start tuning it down to the more detailed design approach, it's going to be very fruitful for you. because it's very rapid. So we have 120 minutes for this session, right? And I'm going to just spend only about 30 minutes talking to you about this approach, and we're going to spend 90 minutes actually going through event storming exercises. And what I'm going to have you do is we're going to divide up into 3 teams, and you are going to decide how you want to model or I should say which model you want to storm out. So your team will come up with a sample project. Could be something that you work on, but that may be too boring. Maybe you want to go for creating a shopping robot, or maybe you want to go for launching, like a drone-based delivery system, or just you come up with the ideas. But we're going to divide into 3 teams. You are then going to choose your approach or I shouldn't say approach. You are going to choose the project that you are going to work on and storm out. And you might start with a big picture because you don't understand it, but within 90 minutes, I want you to actually understand to some significant level the actual domain events, commands, and entities in your model, where you could actually go back to your office this afternoon or tonight or tomorrow morning and start coding on this. And now, what I will say is, I don't typically recommend that you start coding after only 90 minutes or 2 hours of storming. I think in reality what happens is you start out one day with 2 hours of storming. You get kind of this feeling, yeah, I like this. I think maybe we're ready to code, but let's sleep on it tonight. Let's come back tomorrow, spend another 2 hours. After you sleep on it, you'll find, I don't understand this area of the storm that we created. What do we need to do here to make it more accurate? How do we understand it better? So this may actually turn into, this little cluster of sticky notes may turn into another bounded context, right? And so we're going to talk today about bounded context and entities and so forth within your domain model. But this interplay with taking a little bit of time, maybe you take 3 days total, 2 to 3 hours each of those days, and then I think after those 3 days you will know, and that's not even 3 days. When you calculate, it's less than 1 day, right? Total hours, less than 1 day, and you're going to have a very good understanding of the software artifacts that you're going to create. This aligns very well with a DDD approach using event sourcing. So event sourcing is where domain events are saved to a journal, and then those domain events can be played out to other bounded contexts and across the enterprise. And I'll go into that again. But this approach, event storming and event sourcing, work very well together. Now, a couple of the attendees here are experienced with event sourcing. Has anyone else done event sourcing? Here, a little bit? Some? Okay, good. So you'll learn about event sourcing today too, all right? So let's get into the main material. So this is my email address if you want to contact me. And I'll tell you right now before I forget that I'm a partner with Lightbend, and my company is a Lightbend partner, and I get work from in the Scala and Akka area, and we do event sourcing, and I use event storming at work. So if anybody is interested in pursuing that, if you have Scala Akka experience, I'd like to hear from you. And if you want to reach me on Twitter, this is how you can follow me on Twitter. this is my company for comprehension, and I have online learning. So I have a distilling domain-driven design course online that you can take, and I also do live training with my IDD workshop that I told you about, and Go Reactive with Akka is the class that I'm teaching here tomorrow and Tuesday. So we're Magento, or I don't know how you say here, Magento, is sponsoring us there. So we're having our Go Reactive with Akka. This is creating microservices with domain-driven design and actors. So reactive microservices, and and I consult around domain-driven design, and I like to do work in Scala, Akka, and play microservices around that. So this is my first book, Implementing Domain-Driven Design. It's almost 4 years old now, and a book that I've written, Reactive Messaging Patterns with the Actor Model, is about doing Scala and Akka development. And then my most recent book is Domain-Driven Design Distilled, which takes the subject of my 650-page red book and boils that down to about 150 pages. Okay, so if you have any colleagues who don't really, understand DDD or need to be convinced or brought up to speed quickly with it, I recommend this book. 150 pages, you can sometimes read it in 1 day or 2 days. So you come up with a pretty good understanding. So, questions for you. Have you struggled to understand the strategic business values in a project? Do you tend to treat your project just like data? Or do you focus on the behaviors? Actually, what we want to focus on is business value. So view all of these tools as simply a means to bring you closer to understanding what the real business value is, what the strategic implementation of some very significant process will be needed in order to achieve what you're trying to do. Do you wonder where to start developing in Greenfield? Now, when I say Greenfield, I'm not saying purely Greenfield, because almost nobody works in a purely Greenfield environment anymore. There are always, seems like, legacy systems involved. Unless you are working with a very fresh, Series 1, Series A startup, funded startup, you're probably not going to be working in a completely greenfield environment. But what I mean is, greenfield from the standpoint of, we do have a strategic initiative. This is competitively significant for our organization, and we need to experience breakthroughs in our understanding of the domain to try to find what is actually really going to make us great as a company, okay? And a lot of folks like the ideas behind domain-driven design, but oftentimes they don't really understand exactly what should I do first with domain-driven design, where do I start, how do I actually use it on a project, how do I make DDD mesh with Agile, with Scrum, with Kanban, whatever, okay? And I will tell you that I go into detail on how to do that in my distilled book. So chapter 7 was reserved for acceleration and management tools. So how do we actually, event storm and accelerate on this project, make it happen as quickly as we need to be competitive in the market, and then also how do we manage projects within a Scrum environment. So this is true always. Does the business require you to both innovate and accelerate? And as you know, it's a challenge to do both together, because you can say, look, we can innovate if you want us to, but that's going to take us time. So what I'm showing you today in event storming is that if any of these, 4 questions that I've asked kind of intersect with your experience and what you're facing in work, then I think event storming can help you a lot. So what I'm going to do first is give you a little overview of domain-driven design, and then we're going to get into how to take what I'm showing you here and transfer it to sticky notes. Okay? All right. So domain-driven design is about modeling a ubiquitous language in an explicitly bounded context. That means that these, what are representing bounded contexts, are separate models. They're separate software models. And within this boundary, everything within this boundary is explicit and has an absolute meaning. If I use the word product in this context, and it is very semantic and very contextual, I know exactly what I mean when I say the word product here. If I use the term product in an e-commerce setting, in an e-commerce context, product has a certain meaning. But you know what? Product means something different in a product information management system and a product catalog. Even though they're talking about the same thing, there are 2 exact meanings that differ somewhat. But when I say product in an agile project management context, I'm talking about a Scrum product, which is nothing at all like a catalog or a product information management system definition for product. So you can see that when I put a context boundary around the model, I'm going to have very specific meaning about that model and the terminology that we use as a team. Now, within each of these bounded contexts, we have entities, and we have other artifacts as well. But just think about the entities for now. There are not very many entities in any of these. So a DDD bounded context tends to be smallish. I think it's larger, usually, generally speaking, it's larger than one entity, but it's also not a monolith for sure. In fact, I suggest that you use DDD bounded context as a first step approach to microservices, all right? So each of these bounded contexts is also a microservice. You may have reason to split these out later and make smaller microservices, but contextually speaking, each of those entities deployed in a different microservice is still part of the same bounded context because they still share a language. It's just that what I see in my work is that objects and concepts in your domain model that are cohesive will tend to want to be deployed together. And it will be extra work to break those apart and deploy them separately. And so you won't have as natural sort of good feeling in this model because the model will now have to interact with other parts of its own model at an arm's length instead of more intimately like you'll see in a domain model. So what I'm saying is, if you have 5 to 10 entities in a bounded context, that's probably a good sized bounded context. If you have 20, and I'm talking about entity types, okay? Not entity instances, entity types. If you tend to see 20, 30 entity types in a bounded context, I would say that's a pretty good hint that maybe your bounded context is getting too big. I hate to use numbers like that because those numbers could actually be wrong in some circumstances. I'm just saying that in general, you will have smallish bounded contexts. Okay, so this is now where see how we're zooming in. We went from bounded context with multiple bounded contexts to the entities within the context. Now we're zooming in further. One of those entities will receive a command, an imperative to say do this, and that entity, as a result of doing that, will emit a domain event. That domain event is saved to an event journal. It becomes one event in the event stream of this entity. And this entity's entire lifetime is composed with the left fold of all of these domain events that have occurred to it. And so when you reconstitute this entity, you reconstitute it from each of those domain events that have happened to it. And now you can recover the state of this entity at runtime from those events. That, in a nutshell, is event sourcing. Okay? So your events are stored to persistence, and they can be used to recover the state of your entity. They can also be used to send notifications to other components in your own bounded context or in other bounded contexts. And you should strive, if possible, to keep this simple, to keep your events that occur in your bounded context in a total ordering, okay? So the events that happen now are ahead of the events that happen 1 minute from now. And if you can keep those linearly sorted, so to speak, in time order, it will make your life much easier. It's not always possible to do that, but I find that in many, many cases, even in some of the most demanding of domains, that it's still possible to do that, okay? When you get into literally millions of transactions per second, that may not be possible. But who here is working at 1 million transactions per second? Anyone? I mean, I wouldn't doubt if some of you said, yeah, I am, because that's happening these days. I just don't find that it's very common. So if you're operating at 1,000 transactions per second, you can do this. If you're operating at 10,000 transactions per second, you can do this. No problem. Keep your events in total order. Maybe a threshold is, 1 million transactions per second. That might be difficult to keep in total time order. Okay, so now we have a command coming to an event, to an entity, and an event is emitted, stored, and then that event can be broadcast to a number of interested parties. So another component in our microservices architecture is a topic feeder. So we're going to feed our events to some kind of message bus, and I don't mean enterprise service bus. I'm just talking about something like Kafka or RabbitMQ or whatever. You can actually subscribe to a RabbitMQ implementation from Google that will process 2 million messages per second, 1 million in, 1 million delivered per second. So that's high performance, right? So you can actually get this at a very affordable rate. If you want to use Kafka instead, open source, literally very inexpensive to get started with that. This could even be a RESTful resource where you're posting new events and getting events by sequence, in essence, just like you do with Kafka. So there are a lot of different ways to implement this. Now, once the events are in the topic, then those events can be delivered to other bounded contexts, and the event is then translated to a command in the other bounded context, and that command is issued on an entity, and you see the round trip now, right? It just keeps happening across bounded contexts. So one event in might be multiple instances of the same event out to different microservices or bounded contexts. And then this is an actual distributed use case example. I have a product that receives a create product command, and that product will emit two events potentially. It will emit the product created event. It will also emit a discussion requested event if the user said, I want to have a threaded discussion available for this product, but I'm not going to implement that threaded discussion in this bounded context. That belongs to a different ubiquitous language. That belongs in the collaboration context. So it will emit potentially two of these events to the topics. Then the collaboration context sees this discussion requested event, and it's going to create a forum and a discussion entity, and then it's going to create a discussion started event and emit it to its own storage event journal, but then that event will go back to the topics, or will go to the topics, and then the discussion started event will be seen by this bounded context, and it will have an impact on this product, a long-running process, okay? So that's DDD and event sourcing in a nutshell. That's all that I'm really going to tell you about DDD today, but you know, that's a very simple and understandable set of information about this. Now what we want to do is take those ideas and transfer them to sticky notes. So here's what we're going to do. This is how event storming works. It's called event storming because you start with the events. That's your first play. You don't start with the commands. You don't start with the entities, the nouns. You start with the events, the things that will happen in your model. So in time order, from left to right, I'm going to put on orange sticky notes, very important, okay? The event storming police will bust you if you don't use orange sticky notes. Actually, I've been using yellow for years, but Alberto insists that they have to be orange, so I said, okay. Orange it is. Okay, so you write on the sticky notes a verb in past tense. So if the command that causes an event is create product, what is the name of my event? Product created, good. So I'm going to have a product created event happen somewhere in my model. And if that's the very first one that you understand as a team, you're going to write down product created and you're going to put it on your board. your paper, which we have outside. That may not be the first one that occurs, but it is the first one that you know about. But from there, you can start working in either direction to understand what might happen before a product is created and what might happen after a product is created. And so, from left to right, we place in time order these events. Now, this is an approach that I take. I'm not sure if it's the official way, but if you have things that happen in parallel, you can use vertical space to indicate parallelism, right? This and this happen together, or right after this happens, this will happen somewhere along that, and it will definitely happen before this one, for example. Okay, so you can use vertical space for showing parallel. So that's the first step. What I want you to do is, within the first 30 minutes of your event storming session, you have to have at least 30 domain events identified. Okay, so that's going to give you about 5 minutes to find some consensus on what you actually want to model, and then about 25 minutes to come up with about 30 domain events, which tells you what about event storming? What do you think that tells you? It tells you that you're not looking for consensus on everything that might happen. You are storming, right? So you are putting down the things that you think will happen. You can discuss those later, but you're wanting to free your mind of every idea that you have, and this is where the breakthroughs will come through, okay? After we identify at least 30 domain events, and I say 30 because of just the time constraints that we have, you may actually find 50 events in 25 minutes, 30 minutes. If you do, go for it. Don't say, oh, there's 30, let's stop, right? It's not about the number. It's just about saying you have to accelerate and push out ideas. After that, what you're going to do is identify the commands that cause each domain event. So if this domain event is product created, what is the command? Create product, okay? Seems simple, but when you actually get down to this, you might say, huh, okay, this user gesture causes this command to happen, but, you know, it may actually cause more than one event. How do we model that? So it may actually tell you, when you start thinking about the commands, that you've missed some domain events. If you do, put new domain events in. Don't ignore it, all right? Third step. After you have your commands and events, we're going to use yellow stickies to identify the nouns, the entities. So the command happens to the noun, and the event is emitted from the noun. Okay? So across the timeline, which means when you look at this, if you start out putting every orange sticky note, every event right next to each other, you're going to run out of room for making these adjustments. So leave some space, you know, maybe a centimeter or two between each event so that you can come back and have these arranged like this later. As you're going...
Can I have a quick question?
Yep.
Why do we start with events and not commands?
Because we're looking at this from a business process perspective, not from the user's perspective. Okay? In this case, because the commands are actually very user story related. So if you were doing user story mapping, you are actually really starting with commands. But we're starting in the opposite direction because we want to actually say, we don't, you know, right at this moment in time, we don't want to think about how the users see the system. We want to see how the domain experts see the system. And we want them to think about that from a a business process perspective, not from this user does this and then this happens, okay?
Okay.
So just, if you want to do user story mapping, that's a different approach. In fact, I recommend using user story mapping in my distilled book. So it's not like I don't think that it's there, it's just that it is a slightly different approach. Now, what will happen is, along the way, as you are either storming out events or commands, or you start thinking about the entities, you're also probably going to see, there's some sort of a business policy here. There's going to be some complexity around business rules and maybe an individual smaller business process that happens. Mark those business processes or policies with a lilac, purple sticky. We may have to use another color. I'm not sure if we have exactly this color out there, but we'll find something to do to use for that.
Sorry, can you give them an example of business policy?
Consumer can buy a limited number of iPhones, okay? We only allow them to purchase 3 iPhones. If they try to order 5, so that's a simple one. A more complex one is checkout, okay? So if I am checking out, if the consumer is checking out, I have a pretty complex process around checkout, right? And what you may actually want to do is, if this is like a checkout kind of process, you may want to move it off to the side and start drawing arrows with sequences of this is going to happen. First, this process will emit this command, and it will ingest this event, which will cause the next command to be issued, right? Okay? You may or may not want to get to that level of detail in this, but it may happen. Finally, we're going to take pink sticky notes at the end, and we're going to divide off where are our bounded contexts here. Because you're probably going to have multiple bounded contexts that you storm out. You're going to determine, is this really core, or is it supporting? If it's core, it belongs in our core domain bounded context. If it's only supporting, so less important, it belongs over here. Because we might even be able to buy a solution to take care of that thing. Or we can have some contractors outsource do that for us. We want to focus on what's core to the business. Okay? Yep.
Are the business contexts supposed to be ordered in time?
So yeah, yes, it will be ordered in time. And one thing about that is, if you see that this command and this event happen on this noun, and this noun is repeated here, you want it repeated because you want it to remain in time order. We're not trying to create a UML diagram with sticky notes, right? So we're not going to take everything that happens to this noun and put it under here, right? So you repeat them. Yeah, so time order is important. Okay? So that's it, guys. Let's get started. So what we're going to do first is domain events. Step 1, verb and past tense. Let me see what time it is. Hopefully oh, okay. Well, took a little bit more than 30 minutes, but no problem. Okay, so let's just, everybody's sitting at this table here and down to here, you're on a team. You guys sitting this side of the table, you're on yellow shirt. No, actually, we're going to go orange, black down to here. You guys work together, so you can't work together today. And we're going to take the rest of you, yellow shirt, black jacket, blue shirt, Darko, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are 3 areas to work on the side of the building over here. Go find your orange sticky notes and get your pens, and everybody should have a pen and sticky notes, okay? Start storming out, figure out what you're gonna do, and in about 30 minutes,
We are trying to do the event storming of a peer-to-peer lending book system. Okay. So we have several events like book is lent or user-generated lend requests. So basically, people can publish that they have books available for being lent, and other people can find the books which are available for lending and can request the lending, and then the book would be sent to the reader. So it's something like that. We have started by thinking about in a brainstorm way about all the events that might happen in the system, and from that point we continue thinking about the commands which would generate the event, and as a third step we are thinking about the entity involved in that command event process. So it's helping us to identify the entities of the system at some point, and and also the relationships somehow with other entities and other events.
you don't have to make every statement on the storming board very explicit. You have to have some understanding in your mind, but this should be a reminder when you come back. Oh, we had this conversation. We know that this is a policy that needs to be managed in some way. Yeah, but you're not trying to actually code with this, right? So that you're going to code later.
Hi, Vaughn Vernon. We are a software craftsmanship Barcelona, and what are the people doing here?
So they first figured out which core domain they wanted to work in, and they're now identifying the domain events that happen within that business process. So they're storming out the events, and we're taking about 30 minutes to do that, and then the next steps will be ready. The post-it notes are orange for domain events, and they're putting down on the orange sticky notes the name of the domain event that occurs in time order.
Okay, and what is a domain event?
What is a domain event?
An example.
It's something that happens in a domain model. So it could be something as simple as user logged in to something like user is proceeding to checkout, something like that.
Okay, interesting. And you're talking always in past tense. So why the domain event has to be in past tense?
Because the domain event is recording something that has happened.
Okay.
And the fact that it happened previously. So it's always stated in past tense.
Okay, and it can't change.
It cannot change, it's immutable.
Okay, and it can trigger other behaviors in other microservices and stuff like that, maybe?
Exactly. So other microservices can see that this event occurred, and they can react to the fact that this happened, and they might do something, update an entity in their own microservice. So my motivation is to teach domain-driven design, and I also like reactive systems, so this fits in very well with reactive systems, microservices that are explored using domain-driven design.
Okay, perfect. Are you having a nice time here?
I am having a great time, and thanks for the nice little gathering we had last night at the tavern. It was fun to talk with everybody and had a very good time.
Okay, nice to have you here.
All right,
Enjoy.
good to be here.